I think that as a writer, you can often feel quite worried about how you're going to use personal experience and perhaps a bit guilty about using your own life as a source of inspiration. But I think you do have to draw upon what you know sometimes, and you also have to be unafraid to dramatise what you know as well, and to kind of perhaps alter, to look at your own personal experience differently and not always just be obsessed with saying what actually happened, because I think there's a lot of fiction in memory as well, and the way we remember things isn't always as it happened. I think in terms of writing about political things and about public events and how you balance that with writing about your own life, it can be quite tricky to find a way into those big themes, and they can seem a bit daunting sometimes. So the poem that's at the heart of my first collection, Scalp, which takes as its subject the clash between picketing miners and police at Orgreave in the 80s, I knew that I wanted to write about that subject for a long time, because I was born in 1985, so I kind of just missed the strike, really. That wasn't quite within my lifetime, but I was acutely aware of the legacy of that strike, and the legacy of the death of mining, I guess, growing up in northeast Derbyshire in an area that was full of landfill sites and the sort of scars of mining. And so I wanted to try and put that into words, but I was worried that I didn't have the right to, because there were other poets out there who'd lived through it and who'd experienced it much more directly. But actually, it turned out, I think, or it did for me, that I felt like that distance actually helped me to write the poem, because sometimes you do need distance from experience as well in order to be able to put it into words. We all know that when we're experiencing something in the heat of emotion, perhaps we feel like we want to write, but we can't always. You have to remove yourself from it a little bit in order to be able to write about it. And everything slotted into place for me in terms of that poem when I sort of asked myself, what was it that really fascinated me about it? Why was I obsessed with the idea of this term scab and of being a scab? And I realised that I sort of felt on a very minor level, or on a personal level, that perhaps I'd crossed a picket line myself in some way when I went to Cambridge University, and leaving one place and all of its associated history for a very different place, and all the traditions that involved, and feeling like you'd entered a different world. And obviously that's a very melodramatic and dramatised way of putting it, but that melodrama, that dramatisation, and that relationship to my own life was what I needed to be able to write the poem. So I think if you ask yourself, when you're thinking about a big subject, what's my connection to this? Why am I interested in it? And why should I write this poem rather than someone else? Then you can't go far wrong in your writing. This is an extract from a long poem called Scab. This is the first section of the poem about the original clash. Scab. A stone is lobbed in 84, hangs like a star over Orgreave. Welcome to Sheffield, borderland, our town of miracles. The wine turning to water in the pubs, the taxman ransacking the church, plenty of room at every inn. And watch, a car flares into a burning bush. A stone like a star over Orgreave, a spat out word that can't be taken back. They follow it, the bobbies from 10 counties, pickets up from Markham, down from Corton Wood, the cavalry, the 58 Alsatian dogs. They find the houses cold as barns, the whole town gathered in the street, the wise men, shepherds, beasts. Star of Orgreave, star of light, star of fucking royal shite, westward leading, kids want feeding, guide us to your perfect light. One brings a half brick, one brings a shield, one brings a truncheon, one a chain. Bearing gifts we've travelled so far, God or fuck knows who we are. A man, fetal beside the railway tracks, anointment of blood. The role of the poet as commentator and as public voice is one that really interests me, because it is a very long-standing tradition, and I think it's becoming ever more important in a time where we're acutely aware that we can't always trust public sources of authority. We're increasingly aware that what's sometimes reported in the news isn't always what happened. You think of the revelations about the Hillsborough disaster and about the miners' strike, and evidence that comes to light later on about what we were told about those things at the time. So I think it's even more important when we live in an age of spin and kind of media misrepresentations, that poets have this public function in articulating different stories and other people's stories, because that's the great thing about being a writer. You can put, or you can try to put, somebody else's experience into words, and that isn't always the main story or the biggest story. That could be the voice of somebody who hasn't been heard, and you can do your best to bring some of those aspects to attention as well. In terms of writing things down, I often like to carry an idea around in my head for quite a long time, perhaps until there's a connection between my first thought and something else, something different that it connects with. And quite often I'll carry those ideas for maybe up to half a year. It can be quite a long time before I actually put pen to paper. I also like to sometimes go out for a walk or a run and take the poem with me. And what I often find happens is that by the time I've got back, yes, I'll have forgotten some of the things I thought of or some of the lines for the poem, but what stayed with me tends to be the most memorable language and the lines that are the strongest. And poetry is about memorability and about concision. So I think that process of going out without your notebook can be quite a natural form of attrition, and you end up with something that's much stronger as a result sometimes. This is a poem called Dear. It's set in Scotland, and I think it walks that line between fictionalised experience and aspects of remembered experience, perhaps. Dear. The deer my mother swears to God we never saw, the ones that stepped between the trees on pound coin coloured hooves. I'd bring them up each tea time in the holidays, and they were brighter every time I did. More supple than the otters we waited for at Ullapool, more graceful than the kingfisher that darned the river south of Rannochmoor. 5 years on, in that same house, I rose for water in the middle of the night and watched my mother at the window, looking out to where the forest lapped the garden's edge. From where she stood, I saw them stealing through the pines, and they must have been closer than before, because I had no memory of those fishbone ribs, that ragged fur, their eyes, like hers, that flickered back towards whatever followed them.